have to receive information regarding him.
The information you're about to see, much of which has gone unreported until now, will shake the very foundation of the government's cover story about what happened in the Morrow Building in Oklahoma City on the morning of April the 19th, 1995. The news staffs of ABC TV and radio, CNN, Associated Press, as well as those of Time and Newsweek magazines, have known most of these facts for several months. They have chosen to ignore everything that does not seem to further incriminate the FBI's designated guilty parties. For the next 90 minutes, settle back in your easy chair and place yourself in the jury box. You will be seeing evidence that the juries in the real-life trials of Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols may never be allowed to see.
Some time ago, a number of calls came into our network here at White Springs that indicated something was very wrong in the Oklahoma bombing matter. Families of the victims spoke out. They said things were not as the national media was portraying supposed facts. We started looking into the Oklahoma bombing and became more and more concerned, to the point where we commissioned this team to take cameras, investigators, and reporters to Oklahoma City and elsewhere to try to put the pieces together. Expensive, dangerous, but somebody has to do it. What follows now is their report.
Hi, I'm Pat Shannon. Over the past 5 months, I have had 5 separate trips back to Oklahoma City to investigate those mysterious bombings. As you can imagine, it must have been a horrible and a terrifying scene that morning. Men and women went to work just as they'd always done and suddenly died. Trusting parents took their children to a daycare center on the 2nd floor, which just happened to be positioned to where it took the brunt of the 7 floors of concrete above it falling. And 19 children were crushed to death that morning. President Clinton, if you remember, came on the following Sunday to a memorial service for those children at one of the churches in downtown Oklahoma City. In our private investigative circles, we refer to the bombings, plural, because while indeed there may have been an explosion in a Ryder rental truck outside on the street that morning, there also were multiple explosions inside the building. Now, why the federal investigators and the establishment media refuse to acknowledge these facts, we cannot say. Why the BATF refused to answer any questions? For 35 days they were challenged on no one being in their offices that morning. They were finally forced to yield to pressure when a mother who had lost 2 of her babies in the nursery that day came forward on national television to challenge them. At which time a District Director Les Martz from Dallas said that indeed there were 5 agents in the building. In fact, one of them, their local director, Alex McCauley, was riding on an elevator at the 8th floor with the DEA agent, and at the moment of the explosion, they fell to the 3rd floor. But Les Martz lied. Our later investigation proved this. Did Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols really pull off the greatest mass murder in American history? Would a 26-year-old Timothy McVeigh, with just a few years in the military, have the experience and the knowledge to be able to do this? And if so, would he be stupid enough to drive up the highway at 85 miles an hour with no tags on his car? And if he were stopped by the highway patrolman, Charlie Hanger, as he was, would he hesitate to kill one more after murdering 169 people? Why would the President of the United States and his Attorney General make accusations of people and groups around the country, accusations that they knew not to be true? Why did the governor of Oklahoma, Governor Frank Keating, attempt to thwart a member of his own party, Representative Charles Key, who simply wanted and asked for an independent investigation outside of the auspices of the FBI? These are a few of the many, many questions we've been pursuing all summer and will pursue in the next 90 minutes or so. But when we finish, you may have more questions than answers. J.D. Cash is an investigative reporter whom I had the good fortune to meet on my second trip to Oklahoma, and who has worked very closely with me on this case. He is a lawyer who at age 40 retired from his business in Tulsa with enough means to pursue his long-suppressed desire to be a writer. When the explosions in Oklahoma City captured his attention, he immediately began to investigate the discrepancies in the accepted story, the single blast theory. Now, several of his articles about the contradiction of facts in this tragedy have been published locally, but he began to notice that when his editor submitted his articles to the Associated Press, they continually were being ignored. When he finally inquired in person with AP as to why they were not running his articles, he was told by the bureau chief in Oklahoma City that they had been asked by the FBI not to pursue the Middle East connection. Well, J.D. Cash is a tenacious reporter whose experience in the legal profession long ago taught him not to write anything that he cannot document. He has collected astounding facts that you are yet to hear from your television network news.
The 1st of May, I started making some phone calls. There were some things that I was seeing on the national news that didn't add up, and there were some questions. There were a lot of questions that the national news wasn't even asking. And so I started making some phone calls and immediately ran into the Assistant Fire Marshal, Dick Miller. And Dick, I wanted to know where the ATF, DEA, and Secret Service was maintaining their magazines in the building. It was my understanding that they did have magazines in that building, and I wanted to know where they were located. In the conversation, he explained to me that he had never done an inspection of that building because that is a federal building and he's off limits there because of his role as being a city employee. But he did say that he had located, or the bomb squad had discovered at around 10:30 a.m. on the day of the bombing, a 2-foot by 2-foot by 2-foot box marked high explosives. The box was taken by the Oklahoma City bomb squad out to a remote area where it was detonated. His exact words were, "Mr. Cash, when they detonated that, it was definitely high explosives. No question about it." We have a number of witnesses that actually helped the BATF remove high explosives that were still undetonated from the Murrah building after a period of about 2 weeks. And I have since been able to interview a number of civilians who have told me in interviews on tape, on the record, that indeed they did help the ATF remove explosives and weapons such as a tow missile, such as hand grenades, cases of munitions marked explosives. These were removed from the remains of the ATF magazine, which was located on the southeast corner of the Murrah building. And interestingly, this room sits atop the coned-in area, what I call the coned-in area, which is the area where most of the victims were found. This is the pit area. But this room sat right up on top of it and was ruptured.
J.D., how many people have you actually spoken with who heard multiple explosions that morning?
I have talked to so many people who have heard multiple explosions that I have really lost count. We call them the Two Blast Club. Actually, it's no longer a point of dispute, especially when you're interviewing someone who has a military background. Those are the people who have, especially combat veterans who have been under fire. They're very attuned to explosives. I even talked to a demolition expert who was sitting in a cafeteria in Edmond, some 30 miles from the blast site. And it is his custom, when he hears a blast, to use his feet to count the subsequent blast to check for it. And he says there was no question there were 2 blasts that day. And I asked him, I said, well, why do you use your feet? And he said, well, you can't really always trust your hearing. And he said, the reason why I'm alive today is when we set out multiple charges, we use our feet to make sure that all of the charges that we have set off have gone off before we go back and approach the area. So it's just automatic.
Speaking of these explosive experts, did any of them comment to you on the impossibility of an ammonium nitrate diesel fuel bomb being capable of doing this kind of damage?
To the last person. Every time I interview someone for my articles or for a subsequent book, always at the end of the interview or at some point in the interview, I ask them, what stands out in your mind after having been there that day or during the rescue effort? What's the most amazing thing that you saw? And 2 out of 3 times these people say the condition of the building, that they had never seen anything so torn to pieces. And anyone who has ever been through that building who is willing to be honest will always say, look at where the crater is, look at where that area, that coned-in area is. It doesn't make any sense. Obviously, there were other explosions in that building that day, and that is universal.
Michael Hinton was born in Atlanta, but spent much of his early life in England. He works as a lobbyist at the Oklahoma Capitol building. In April, he lived in the YMCA building on Northeast 5th Street, and his daily routine was to catch the city bus that stopped across the street in front of the Murrah building at 8:50 a.m. On the morning of the blast, having just missed his usual bus by a minute, he made a fateful decision. Had he not made the right one, he undoubtedly would have been the 170th person to die in explosions. Mr. Hinton has definite convictions about the question of a second blast.
I am active with Ross Perot's United We Stand America. I was a federal law enforcement officer for nearly 22 years. That included the military service. And I'm here actively in the Oklahoma City area where I'm continuing my duty and service to my country. April 19th, I just had came out the YMCA, run across the street on the Northwest 5th Street in Robinson area, about I'd say 50 feet diagonal direction to the federal building. And I'm standing there on the corner that morning waiting for a Metro Transit bus, and I discovered, it was at 10 minutes till 9 at the time I was standing there, and I discovered I'd missed 2 buses. So at 8:55 or about 8:56 that morning of April 19th, 95, I run down to Northwest 5th and Broadway. Another bus was coming through the intersection, and I caught him just in time. This bus was running late. But I got on and went on to the transfer terminal where I was to catch another bus bound for the state capitol. Well, after I got off of the bus to transfer onto the bus that's headed for the state capitol, it hadn't even been hardly 2 minutes before I heard this very violent rumble under the bus. And it occurred 2 times where the bus rocked on its side twice. And I'd say this occurred about 6 to 7 seconds apart. At that time, none of us knew what was going on, and I commented to the bus driver, I said, Mike, what was that all about? And we thought maybe another bus coming in had crashed into us or lost its brakes or something, so, we were all just sitting there in, a state of shock, like, we'd never felt nothing like that. But the bus, something to raise a bus, that much, equipment that heavy. And it was an interesting thing that the news reporters kept emphasizing on all of the local tele channels is that the Murrah building just had received a bomb threat 1 week prior to the actual bomb explosion that morning of April the 19th.
You had witnessed this, had you not?
Yes, I had witnessed. Now, what is interesting is that on a Wednesday, it's been about April 12th, 1 week exact, before the bombing actually occurred. It was in the afternoon, I would say 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a gathering of, I'd say, it was 350 to 400 people standing around the federal building. I'm looking at me wonder at this, and I'm saying, like, well, what could be going on at the federal building? I said, well, maybe they had a fire drill, maybe there was some type of ceremony going on, but the more I looked and watched this, I watched these people about 30 minutes, And, it didn't appear that anything that was formal, like I said, going on. People were standing there, engaged in conversations and what have you. So I started to go across the street and inquire, and I said, well, maybe it's just a fire alarm went off or something, so I paid no more attention to it. But on the morning of the bomb explosion, and they're emphasizing that the Murrah building had received a threat, the thought came to me then, well, what I had observed out my window 1 week prior, that may have what was going on then.
Was there any doubt in your mind or anyone's mind that there were two incidents here, 5 or 6 seconds apart?
Well, I can't speak for the other passengers. I can only speak for me. What I personally heard and know for myself, that there were two distinct explosions that I heard, and the bus responded twice by rocking on its side like it did. In fact, on that second explosion, I thought, well, for a while there, the bus is going to turn over.
Mr. Hinton has a friend who works in the downtown library just a block behind the Murrah building. It, too, received severe enough damage to close it for several weeks. The two later had a conversation about the matter, and Michael asked him,
I says, where were you on the morning of the bomb explosion? He says, Michael, I was right here in the library. I says, how many explosions did you hear? He said, I heard what appeared to be two distinct explosions and possibly a third.
Despite the best efforts of the authorities, the two-blast theory rolls on. More witnesses come forward. Jim Ferguson is a heating and air conditioning engineer and a foreman in charge of many of the downtown federal buildings in Oklahoma City, and of course at one time the Murrah building. His office is downstairs in the United States Courthouse, and he was on the scene doing rescue in less than 1 minute after the explosion. And his version of what happened destroys almost every major point of the government story. When I asked Jim if he had heard two explosions, he answered as if I had naively asked him if he still believed in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Why, heck yeah, I heard two explosions, he told me. Everybody in town heard two explosions. His wife, sitting at the table, then told us that she and her mother-in-law, Jim's mother, were at the farmer's market, about 1.5 miles southwest of the Murrah building that morning. They heard the first explosion, turned to see what was going on, saw a cloud rising from the Murrah building, and about 5 or 6 seconds later, she described it, saw a second mushroom cloud rise from the building following a second explosion. ABC Television's Good Morning America wanted to talk to the maintenance crew at the federal buildings. Jim Ferguson, of course, was part of that. And all went well until he began to tell about bullets zooming by his ear a half an hour or so after the explosion when he was doing a rescue on the 3rd floor. Cameras began to roll again as excited reporters jumped forward with their pads and pencils to hear this man's story. He said, I was in Vietnam. I know what bullets going by your ear sound like. And they said, what are you talking about? And he explained that the cache of ammunition from the 9th floor, where the building had ruptured, had dumped into the automobiles down on the ground, and the fires there were setting off ammunition, and bullets were zinging by Jim's head. It's made a great story, a human interest story, a blockbuster of a story. But when it got to New York, someone chose to cut the segment, and it was never aired. I asked Jim if he had trouble breathing once he was inside the Murrah building. He said yes, he was there in less than a minute. In fact, the dust was still rising. I said, what about gas? What about fire? And he was very emphatic and said there was absolutely no gas, no flames in the Murrah building. We spoke with the Fergusons at their home on the night of Wednesday, June 14th, 1995. The next afternoon, June 15th, I reported this story over the People's Radio Network nationwide. A few days later, Jim had a visit from 2 FBI agents. And it was for this reason that he subsequently refused to go on camera with us for this documentary or even be interviewed by anyone else. You could call him another witness intimidated by those who were supposed to be attempting to solve the crime. Now, I'm not an explosive expert by any means, but however, to a man, you should know that every explosive expert, from former Navy SEALs to civilian owners of demolition companies that we talked to, have all told us that an ANFO bomb, that's ammonium nitrate fuel oil, ANFO. An ANFO bomb has two glaring signatures, nitrate gas and fire. Even after the flames are out, you can't go near that scene for an hour or two without a gas mask. If the FBI and the control news media were seriously looking for the real facts of the case, would they not attempt to draw conclusions from the evidence of witnesses such as Jim Ferguson? His testimony not only strengthens the likelihood of there having been multiple bombs on the scene, but all but eliminates the possibility of this damage having been caused by an ANFO explosion. The evidence shows that if there even was an ANFO bomb outside, it was only large enough to cause a diversionary effect, strong enough to destroy not much more than whatever vehicle carried it and maybe some windows, but thereby igniting the numerous car fires in immediate proximity and allowing its nitrate gas to dissipate quickly into the open air. According to every independent expert we spoke with, the truck bomb simply could not have been large enough to cause the massive damage seen at the Murrah building. J.D. Cash and I had been wondering how so many ATF agents appeared on the scene so suddenly after the explosion. And if they actually were at work that morning, why were they outside the building and not in their offices on the 9th floor?
This became a national issue on May the 23rd, on the day of the demolition, when Edie Smith was on CNN following the demolition of the Murrah building. And she brought it to the country's attention that she had a lot of questions about what the ATF knew prior to the bombing.
You know, we want to know, a government agency on the 9th floor who's supposedly the target of the bombing, where none of their employees were in the office that day. I mean, did they have a warning or didn't they? We can't get them to answer.
Early on, Pat, I assumed that the reason that the BATF was not at their office that day was because possibly just a superstitious thing. It's April the 19th. Their supervisor said, hey guys, maybe tomorrow isn't a good day to be at work. And they just went out and played golf or whatever. And about 2 weeks into this, I started receiving information from witnesses and from concerned citizens asking me to look into this a little bit closer. And as I began to locate individuals that had information about the ATF's whereabouts that day, it became startlingly clear that they were outside of their office that day, but incredibly close to the building.
I asked J.D. just exactly what particulars he had uncovered with the witnesses who had been willing to talk.
We have one witness that we've taken down and put in a broadcast theater and put him on tape, on camera, his face blacked out, changed his voice in order to protect him. And this individual has told us that he saw 6 to 8 ATF agents 14 to 16 minutes after the blast working the crater area, working the rubble, looking for bomb fragments outside the Murrah building on the morning of the blast.
Another witness confronted an ATF agent outside.
A local broadcasting company, a local affiliate, has a witness that they have interviewed on more than one occasion who, along with this person's supervisor, rushed up to the building 2 minutes after the blast. And the first person that person encountered was a jacketed ATF agent. And when I say jacketed, I'm talking about their raid jacket where their initials are clearly marked. This witness told the television interviewer that he looked up at the 9th floor. Now, this particular person happened to know, because of his wife's position with the government, he happened to know that ATF officed in that building. And he pointed up there to the 9th floor, which was largely destroyed, and then looked at this individual and said, "How are you alive?" And the ATF agent, according to this witness, said, "I was told not to come in this morning. We've had a bomb threat."
We talked about another witness who was parked on the street only 100 paces from the Ryder truck.
He survived nicely. It's amazing. When he gets out of the truck and he walks up to the parking lot, the very first group of officers that he sees are ATF agents in their raid jackets. He was amazed. These stories keep coming back over and over and over again.
Just exactly where were the agents that morning? We know for a fact that 3 were in Ponca City at an arson trial. 2 more were downtown Oklahoma City at the U.S. Courthouse at a similar arson trial. 1, Agent Luke Franey, was on the 9th floor of the Murrah building. Another, Alex McCauley, the agent in charge, claimed to have been on the elevator. Claims to have fallen from the 8th floor to the 3rd floor. 5 others were unaccounted for. We wonder, 5 or 6 unaccounted for. Les Martz put out a memo to all the ATF and IRS offices across the country saying that Edie Smith's accusations were groundless. That not only were ATF personnel victims, but they were heroes doing rescue. That Alex McCauley went on a 5-story free fall in the elevator. But the inspectors at the elevator company said, no way.
None of these elevators had any of the switches thrown which would be thrown if there had even been an increase in speed of 10%. That's one of the safety features of those elevators in the Murrah building. And I asked him, I said, well, what about a free fall? I asked this of 3 or 4 or 5 of these gentlemen. And each one has sort of laughs and says, elevators, the modern elevator doesn't free fall. It has unless you cut the cables. They have the way that they have a counterbalancing mechanism, which if the power goes off, the elevator would be more likely to rise than it would to do anything else. So the idea of an elevator free falling is ludicrous.
There were no severed cables in the Murrah.
And there were no severed cables. The bottom line is, this story, which has been put out in news releases by the ATF, is not correct. It is not accurate, and they should have done a better job than this if they were trying to account for where Agent McCauley was.
At the close of our interview, I requested that J.D. Cash give us his summation of what we will call our theory number 1.
With 3,500 pounds of pressure or more, C4 will be detonated. There's 2 ways to detonate it. You can either use percussion caps, which is what it's designed for, or 3,500 pounds of pressure. That will set it off. If it went off in that way and took out, the only thing it had to do was take out that one pier. Pier number 3 is what we call it. And when that goes, there goes 8 floors, and there's your pit area, and there are most of your casualties that day. But for sure and for certain, the pit area and that southeast area, that coned-in area of the building, the damage was done by a separate blast. It has no relationship whatsoever to the crater, which is more towards the west, and certainly if the fertilizer bomb could do the damage to the southeast area, it would have done it all the way across to the western area. This is a remote area from the fertilizer bomb, if it was indeed a fertilizer bomb.
Representative Charles Key is a 41-year-old businessman and not a lawyer, he's quick to point out, now in his 5th term as a member of the state legislature. Many of the victims' families live in his district, in the western portion of Oklahoma City. Mr. Key sensed there may be an ongoing federal cover-up in this case and attempted to initiate a legislative investigation conducted by a House committee. His efforts were swiftly foiled.
We asked for the Speaker of the House to appoint a special House committee, not a joint Senate House committee, not one created by the governor or anyone else, but a House committee, because the nice thing about members of the House, they have 2-year terms, they're closely aligned with their constituency because of that, smaller constituency, so typically the House feels a little bit closer to the people and moves a little bit quicker on things. And that's why I asked for a House committee investigation. We asked the Speaker of the House to have an interim committee special investigation. We do that all the time, like probably most legislative bodies do. We have interim committee studies. So this wouldn't be anything that would be out of the ordinary except the topic involved. And we were flatly turned down. Much like the governor said, the Speaker said that
We should have more faith in the investigative bodies, and that any information we had should be turned over to them. And as many people well know, most of the information that we are having problems with and still have problems with today have already been turned over to them. They're already aware of that information. The problem is they've been giving an official explanation for some of these elements in what happened on the 19th that don't add up with reality and fact, according to many experts.
Do you feel like there's some kind of cover-up going from the federal side of the fence?
I'm convinced that there are some, at the very minimum, there are some in the government that are covering up certain information. Now, whether there's a big conspiracy, an overall cover-up of some big conspiracy, we don't know. But we all have a right to know, especially the people in this city and this state and the victims and their families that were affected by this.
So this was your whole idea in having an independent investigation. Do you think there's any chance of this happening at a later date?
It's possible. Frankly, I don't have that much faith in our legislative leadership to make that decision, to turn around a decision that they've already made, unfortunately.
What did Governor Keating have to say about the idea?
Unfortunately, Governor Keating was very critical when he didn't have to be. He and I being of the same party, I thought that he would maybe adhere to Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment and not be critical of a fellow Republican. But he was somewhat critical of me and my request for the investigation when he didn't have to be. And he's been critical of just about everyone that has brought any questions up about what happened on the 19th and whether there was foreknowledge and a number of other issues.
We asked Representative Key if there could have been a Middle Eastern connection.
We know that in the first few days after the bombing that there were Middle Eastern or Iraqi individuals that were believed to be involved and that were seen leaving the scene of the crime and that were pursued by the authorities. And one of those individuals was called John Doe number 2, and they even put a $2 million price tag on his head. Looked for him for a long time, and then a couple of months later they decide that there was no John Doe number 2 at all. And we know that there is definitely a Middle Eastern connection in this crime. We have other people that have given eyewitness testimony, given 100% ID of individuals that were at the scene of the crime that were of Middle Eastern descent. So we know that there were people involved other than McVeigh that were of Middle Eastern connections.
Have you any idea why the FBI would suddenly begin to ignore these people?
It has been reported that there are people in Oklahoma City that are former Iraqi soldiers that fought in Saddam Hussein's army in Desert Storm, and that at least one of these individuals may be connected to the bombing in some way. I don't know if that's true yet. We need to know if that's true. We need that to be pursued fully. And if it is, I can see where some individuals may not want that to be made public because of how the public may react to giving asylum to Iraqi soldiers that we fought against in a very recent war. And that might be connected to a tragedy like this. That's pure speculation. But we have that information from good sources, and maybe that's part of the reason why this has been swept under the rug, apparently.
Indeed, it may have been swept under the rug thus far, but there are private citizens who refuse to let it remain there.
Now, what caused those explosions, we don't know exactly. But the people have a right to know what those explosions and who was responsible for that damage.
Glenn Wilburn is a CPA, and he was in his office 18 blocks north of the explosion site that morning. He was on the scene by 9:20 and remembers the inordinate amount of jacketed BATF agents who were already there. As grandfather of the 2 Smith boys who died in the nursery, it bothers him that none of the agents had their children there that day. He questions the government story and is very aware of a campaign of disinformation being dispensed by the news media. We talked about this, his concern about the ever-present rumors about the Middle Easterners and the terrified witnesses who are still refusing to come forward with what they know. We were speaking of the infamous John Doe number 2.
Interesting how he doesn't exist, but yet we have eyewitnesses that saw him. And the FBI has been aware of this since day 2. We have 4, maybe 5 witnesses that have ID'd these two being together here in Oklahoma City. It was at the corner of Main Street and Robinson immediately after the explosion. You have a brown pickup that has 2 men in it. One of them positively identified as being a Mideastern type man. And this pickup has since been followed. We followed the trail of this pickup, and the FBI have picked this pickup up from a local apartment house complex, and this pickup was subsequently spray painted yellow and dumped in this area of this apartment complex. And it's our understanding the FBI had this pickup, and they in fact have said that this pickup was involved in the bombing. And it appears to us from witnesses that this pickup was driven and dumped in this parking lot by a Mideastern looking man. We have to wonder what is going on here. Why does the FBI not want to admit or to even be investigating the possibility of Mideast connection? And that opens up a whole bag of worms, because it appears to me if there's a Mideast connection, it requires a response from Washington, an international response. Now we're into the political spectrum of it. And is it just possible that Washington does not want there to be a Mideast connection? And once again, we have the FBI being an image upholder of Washington.
Early in our investigation, witnesses mentioned having been intimidated. I asked if this had been Glenn's experience.
I was told that a private investigator in Dallas, Texas, had been told by someone on the inside, and presumably that means someone inside the ATF, that he better not even touch this case. He'd been asked by some people in Oklahoma City to do a little work on this case and ask some questions regarding ATF. And I was told that the person that he talked to said, don't touch it, don't even think about it, and the people in Oklahoma City that are asking questions are going to be in big, big trouble. During the massive manhunt for John Doe number 2, as amazing as it sounds, we got a call from the FBI wanting to inquire about my 14-year-old son, how old he was and where he went to school at, because someone had told them that he looked like John Doe number 2.
Oh my goodness.
Now he's 14 years old, and of course I was livid, and I don't know if it's just intentional harassment or if it's simple incompetency on their part, but they did have the audacity to call here. Well, we're still grieving over the loss of Chase and Colton and want to know about my 14-year-old son.
The day after Edie's story seemed to expose the ATF's absence, the family was paid a visit by IRS, ATF, and the United States Attorney. But Glenn had a question for them.
In the short time they were here, I said, you know, now that we know the significance of April the 19th, we know that to the militia it is a very important day. There are significant things that have happened before on April 19th, and there was a significant thing happening that day on April the 19th in Arkansas. April 19th had a lot of symbolism, and I asked them, I said, you know, as professional law enforcement officers, and it's your job to just try to stay up with these things and know of times when there's danger. I said, did it not occur to you there could be danger that day? That it just might be a bad day somewhere? And of course, both the ATF agents said absolutely not. But very interesting, after the meeting and 2 hours later at noon, I'm watching television on CNN, and of all things, I see Mr. Beerball from CNN interviewing John McGaugh, the head of ATF out of Washington, D.C. And it's kind of deja vu, because Beerball asked the exact same question to Mr. McGaugh that I had asked to the agents in my living room that morning.
I was very concerned about that. We did some things here in headquarters and in all of our field offices throughout the country to try to be more observant. But it was primarily, we didn't anticipate something like this. We were thinking about, demonstrations and things like that.
He saw this only 2 hours after his morning meeting. What were his feelings?
I'm assuming they lied to me. Somebody lied to me. Either McGaugh lied on national TV or the 2 guys in my living room lied to me. Somebody was lying that morning. appears to me.
So were there 2 blasts or even more? Remembering Jim Ferguson's reply to that question and so many others who agree with him, we have to believe that it is true. Now we know that it to be a slight exaggeration that everybody in town heard 2 blasts, because many people we interviewed who were inside the Murrah building at the time heard no blast at all, and at first thought they'd been hit by an unexpected tornado. But many more on the outside, such as Michael Hinton on the city bus, heard and felt 2 definite and separate explosions. Here we have an opportunity for you, the viewer, to be an on-the-scene ear witness. At 9:02 on the morning of April 19th, there was a meeting going on in the conference room of the Oklahoma City Water Board, which was housed across the street and only 100 feet or so west of the Murrah building. It was so close that people died there in the ensuing moments. Now here's a tape recording of that meeting that was taking place. You may decide for yourself how many blasts you are hearing amidst the pandemonium. We begin 9 seconds before the explosion.
With regard to this proceeding, basically there are 4 elements that I have to receive information regarding.
Everybody, let's get out of here. Now, what's the electricity line? What's the light? What's the light? Out the back door. All the way to the right, Kelly.
We postulate that the pop, which can be heard 4.2 seconds prior to the explosion, is a detonator which failed to function. Explosives normally have a backup detonator. We propose that this is what triggered this blast. Experts have stated that the ANFO blast should have lasted 5 seconds. The recorder had an auto gain control which was activated by the intensity of the sound of the blast. The top of the sound was cut out for almost 10 seconds. Only overlapping explosions could have caused the auto gain control to remain engaged for this length of time.
There was at least one other tape recorder operating in the vicinity that morning. An attorney was drafting a letter to his dictating machine at the time. Now, although the lawyer's office was farther away from the scene than the water board building, and the fidelity of the recording is not as good, the same details are obvious. A pop precedes explosion by precisely 4.2 seconds on this one too. This data, of course, is insufficient to reach any firm conclusion. However, it would seem apparent that an event which preceded the truck bombing by 4.2 seconds was recorded at 2 separate locations in Oklahoma City. This, coupled with the information recorded by the seismograph machines in Norman, should have been cause for further investigation. Dr. Charles Mankin is the man in charge of the Oklahoma Geological Center at Norman, which is 16 miles south from downtown Oklahoma City. His credentials are impeccable. His knowledge of the celebrated seismogram from 9:02 a.m. on April 19th may be surpassed only by that of his colleagues, Drs. Ken Luza and Ray Brown, who also just happened to concur with Dr. Mankin. In layman's language, something happened in that event to cause 2 separate bleeps of some 5 seconds each to appear on the seismograph.
So having that kind of information was puzzling as to why you'd have 2 separate events that gave virtually identical signals.
Dr. Mankin explained that he and his colleagues believed this to be caused by subsurface structures creating a delay in the signal's travel time, thereby reflecting a mirrored event. However, he was quick to point out,
so while that explains the rationale for the 2 different signals, we're still left with the issue of how do you explain the duration of each of those signals.
the seismic evidence combined with the audio recordings points to a dual explosion larger than possible with a single ANFO bomb. This precludes the theory of McVeigh and Nichols acting alone. unless it can be proven that one or the other was inside the building that morning.
Brigadier General Ben Parton of Alexandria, Virginia. He holds a Distinguished Service Medal. He's twice received the Legion of Merit. He was a distinguished graduate of the Air War College. He holds 2 master's degrees and is a candidate for a PhD. His expertise over most of his 31-year career in the United States Air Force was demolition, and he headed up the Explosives Research Laboratory for the Air Force. He knows how buildings fall and what the identifying signs are as evidence of detonation after they have fallen. He could tell immediately, from nothing more than pictures in magazines, that the American people were not being told the truth about the Oklahoma City tragedy. In mid-May, a 7-page letter went from the retired Air Force general to Senator Don Nichols of Oklahoma, imploring the senator to take steps to stop the demolition of the Murrah building on May the 23rd. To allow this building to be demolished would be tantamount to the commission of another crime. At a minimum, it would be destruction of evidence, said the former high-ranking military officer. We caught up with General Parton in Albuquerque, where he was presenting all these findings on the subject to a large audience at the University of New Mexico.
My forte and interest has been in the weapons business for many, many years. And when I saw the circulated, published information about the bombing in Oklahoma, I just knew there was something phony about it. Number one, the pictures were grossly asymmetrical, and you just don't get that with bomb damage. The level of damage for the size munition they were talking about was incompatible with the damage to the building. And I gathered all the information that I could, all the pictures that I could, all the stuff that was published, and I sat down and got the floor plan for the building and as much information as I could on the building structure, and I came to the conclusion that there had to have been demolition charges in the building. There's no way you could have, no way what happened down there could have happened without demolition charges in the building. And I knew that those demolition charges had to be on 3 specific columns. But I felt across the front, if it had been an outside job, that those demolition charges would have been at the base of the columns on the front of the building because they were available and accessible to anyone on the sidewalk. But there was one column back in the middle of the building that came down, and it certainly couldn't have been taken out with the demolition charge without someone having access to the building. So I prepared a memorandum, and I sent it to about 60 members of the Senate and the House, laying out my concern. And Don McIlvaney and I got on the radio talk shows. We both agreed we would hit as many as we possibly could and try to get the Senate and the House to take some action to keep that building from coming down until we could have an independent assessment of what happened, because I knew when that building came down there would be evidence forever destroyed. And I suspected that there may be an effort to cover up things, so I felt that we ought to have a separate and independent investigation. Of course, the Senate and the House both acted with their normal black hole kind of an operation. I never did hear from Senator Nichols from Oklahoma. I got a letter back from Senator Warner espousing his wholehearted support for a number of the conditions in the so-called anti-terrorism bill. And Congressman Frank Wolf sent back a letter, and I knew him well. And he said, "Dear Ben, thank you for your info copy." It was addressed to him. He said, "What you're discussing is above my level of expertise. I have sent it to the FBI for the information and assessment and evaluation." I then knew that he didn't understand what the letter was all about.
Disgusted with the attitude of Congress and dissatisfied with the government's clumsy explanations, General Parton personally carried his investigation to Oklahoma City.
There's a company in Oklahoma that had pictures that were made throughout the cleaning up of the building. They hauled over 315-ton truckloads of material away from that building, hauled it out to a landfill, smashed it down with equipment as much as they could, covered it up with dirt, put it behind a chain link fence with guards on the gate. So if that's not a figurative and a literal cover-up, I don't know what is a cover-up.
Was this destruction of evidence precipitated because the government prosecutors feared the remaining forensic evidence might clear their official suspects, McVeigh and Nichols? Or would it have proven ATF, DEA, and Secret Service carelessly stored dangerous explosives on the 8th and 9th floors? General Parton feels the photographic evidence disputes the last half of this theory.
And here is the stub of column B3. And the top of that column is at the 3rd floor level. And if you examine that column closely, you can see that the rebar is still sticking out the top, and it has all the appearance of a demolition charge, the kind of damage you would get from a demolition charge at the top of that column, where it had a juncture with floor number 3.
General, would you explain to us the particulars, what your message is? What are you trying to get across?
Well, I'm trying to show, with this layout of the building structure, the pattern of damage that was done to the building from whatever was doing damage. And what I found that you had demolition charges in the building plus the truck bomb outside. Now this is the pressure pattern that you would get from the truck bomb located at this position. And that's about the size of the explosive charge of 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate with enough fuel on it. And even though you had about 500,000 pounds out here per square inch, by the time that pressure wave got to the first point of contact with the building was right here, you're down to about 375 pounds per square inch.
Now the columns with the X's you've marked are on the 3rd floor.
The columns with the X's I marked are the columns that I concluded were taken out by demolition charges.
At the 3rd floor level?
At the 3rd floor level. A blast. There was a blast from the truck bomb.
There was?
There was a blast from the truck bomb.
But not strong enough to damage the header or blow it in.
That's right. But as I indicated, there is the evidence from the pictures that show that these columns were failed by demolition charges.
With evidence inside, was it really necessary to destroy the Murrah building? General Parton asked that question too.
And I talked to the architect, as I indicated before, and the architect told me, and this is the one who was there supervising and advising on shoring up the building. He said the building that was standing was sound. It was his recommendation that the building be rebuilt because everything still standing was structurally sound, and he felt the building could be rebuilt.
Pat Shannon asked General Barton if this could have been a staged event in order to accelerate the passage of anti-terrorism legislation currently before Congress, which, if passed, would undermine American civil rights. These are his conclusions.
They were federalizing crime in this country when the Constitution clearly leaves it to the local level and the state level. They were giving the FBI and the BATF and any law enforcement agency in this country powers over the American people that the American people had never seen before. It's the same kind of power over the people that the Gestapo in Germany was exercising and the KGB in Russia were exercising. And I just didn't want to see that imposed on the people in this country.
Now we come to our 3rd and final theory. 3 columns on the front row and 1 in the 2nd row were taken out with 4 strategically placed charges. As in theory number 2, the ANFO bomb outside in the truck was no more than a diversionary tactic and did little damage.
So we have 3 possible scenarios now. 3 situations that could have happened. none of which fits into the government's cover story of a single ANFO explosion on the street and of Tim McVeigh acting alone. However, we believe we can correctly assume that there was an ANFO bomb that exploded in a truck outside the Murrah building. So at this point, we must suppose that one of three things happened. First, Tim McVeigh, along with John Doe 2, whoever he is, and acting in concert with absolutely no one else at the scene, parked the truck loaded with explosives, ignited it at the scene with the fuse or from a remote location moments later, and set off the blast. They were not aware that explosives had been stored on the 9th floor by DEA, BATF, and the Secret Service. The truck explosion on the outside triggered the cache on the inside a few seconds later. This would account for the multiple explosions heard by hundreds of witnesses and even captured on tape, as well as the two separate shakes on the seismograph, 5 seconds apart. One can imagine the embarrassment, not to mention the liability, the agency would shoulder if these facts became public knowledge. Therefore, it was in the best interest of the government to demolish the building to prevent any further investigation. But we know also from the unanimity of opinion of a multitude of experts that this alone could not have sheared the columns and cut this kind of pattern through the structure. Therefore, we must eliminate this supposition almost as quickly as we consider it. In our third case scenario, we have the conditions presented by General Parton, and the facts seem to make his the strongest case of all. Remember, he's a bona fide demolition expert from the United States Air Force, and of the precise ilk the government would have brought forward a long time ago if his testimony had been favorable to them. Of course it's not. His scenario could have included Tim McVeigh only on the fringes at best, and certainly not the mastermind. You see, both General Parton and the BATF are very aware that if Parton is correct, and he is certain that he is, it would have to involve duplicity at the highest levels of government. Those columns could not have been drilled and wired, and those charges so strategically placed without a team on the inside. Some say that this would have taken several days and not feasible because the activity would have been witnessed by too many people. But General Parton says the columns did not have to be drilled and wired, not even wrapped, he says. He says a bucket full of C4 or C5, maybe a cubic foot in size and weighing about 60 pounds, placed next to the columns he's identified would have had the sufficient power to shear those columns, turn the concrete to powder, and leave only the rebar as evidenced. This operation could have been performed in 10 minutes, said General Parton. And we found that to be interesting. The building foreman told us that there was no security in the Murrah building after 11 o'clock at night, when the cleanup crew left. Only a night watchman who patrolled the area around the U.S. courthouse. Now, with proper timing in Watergate fashion, it would have been a simple matter for those with keys and knowledge of the alarm system to enter, place the charges, and then be gone from the area before the watchman returned on his routine rounds. If the truth is ever known, we agree with General Parton that of the three, this supposition will prove to be the closest to that truth.
Desire.